reason to pray. We don't get fooled again. No, no.
Hi everybody, and welcome to the newest edition of Kenduck's Classroom, where my motto is, don't get fooled again on your next history test. And today what I'm going to do is I'm going to start my series on U.S. presidents. And I can't think of any better place to start than President Washington, number one, the guy who created the original model and template for the U.S. presidency. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend the first few minutes talking about all the domestic affairs that happened under President Washington. So when I say domestic, I mean all the things that happened within the United States. And then what I'll do is I will chat a little bit about all the foreign affairs that occurred during the Washington presidency. Okay, so first some interesting facts about the presidency of George Washington. George Washington was and still is the only president ever elected unanimously by the Electoral College. Of course, not once, but twice. President Washington took office in 1789, and he was reelected in 1792, and he left office in March of 1797. The last kind of introductory fact about President Washington is that you can't really find a political affiliation. There wasn't a political party that he was part of. Political parties had just begun to kind of form, and if you look in a textbook or if you check online, most sources either say none for political party or there's a line through it, although there is evidence that he was kind of leaning towards the Federalist Party back in the day because he seemed to take the advice and he seemed to accept the wisdom quite often of his Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. And that's actually the first domestic affair that I'm going to start out with, is George Washington's creation of a presidential cabinet. Now, in Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution, it does say that the president can have advisors. And so the president created a small group of men that would help him make decisions. And the big rivalry that actually created the beginning of political parties was between Washington's Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, who, by the way, was Washington's aide-de-camp during the Revolutionary War, and Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, a fellow Virginian. And so every president since Washington has created a cabinet. Now there's dozens of members of the president's cabinet, but Washington was the first one to create a cabinet where he had a Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, and his Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, give him advice. And speaking of those two, Hamilton and Jefferson had a major rivalry, and you have to check out my video on the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, which were the first two political parties that were forming at the time. But one of the big achievements of the Washington presidency was the creation of the United States Bank, or the BUS, the Bank of the United States Government. And this is something that Jefferson was against. He believed that the states should do that. But Alexander Hamilton, as the Secretary of Treasury, thought that we need a bank. England had a bank, and a bank is good. It's a safe place to store money. A bank is a good place because a bank can lend money, and so people can invest. In this case, the U.S. government would be able to invest and lend money and borrow money. So though it was controversial, the bank, or the so-called BUS, did come into play in Washington's presidency. Now, another economic reform that Alexander Hamilton kind of persuaded Washington to agree upon was the so-called national debt. Now, usually, when you think of debt, you think of bad things, but actually, a debt can actually be good because it helps you establish credit. If you borrow money and you pay money back, well, then someone else tends to want to lend you more money. And so establishing credit is very important. And that's one of the things that the United States was going to have to do if they were going to build their infrastructure and pay off their debts. They would have to create this national debt. And what actually happened was the federal government collected the debt of the 13 states and just called it the national debt. And there were a couple different ways that the debt was going to be paid down. One was actually this tax on whiskey, so-called excise tax on whiskey. But I'll get to that in a minute. So the two biggest economic kind of reforms that were put into the U.S. government during Washington's presidency were the national debt and the assumption of the state debt, and the Bank of the United States. Now, I said something earlier about this whiskey tax, which was going to be collected from the citizens of the United States to pay down the debt. Of course, now the Constitution gave Congress the ability to collect taxes, and with this tax collection in the form of a tax on whiskey, that's what would help apparently pay down or contribute to paying down this new national debt. Well, the farmers in western Pennsylvania are not very happy about their whiskey being taxed. Now, they don't grow whiskey, they distill whiskey, which comes from wheat, which is one of the big natural resources from the state of Pennsylvania. And actually, some of the men in Pennsylvania, the farmers, they actually use whiskey in some cases almost as currency, as money. And so think about it. The gentlemen in western Pennsylvania think that their money is being taxed, and that's not a good thing. Of course, if you're saying, well, Mr. Kenduck, why didn't the wheat farmers just make wheat and not distill it into whiskey? Well, the truth of the matter is it's so much easier to bring whiskey to market, than wheat. So, in regards to this so-called whiskey excise tax, these western Pennsylvania farmers are very upset. And what do you do in this country when you're upset back then? You pick up your weapons and you fight and you kill and you threaten to overthrow the government. But President Washington knows that the U.S. government cannot be challenged, or if it is challenged, this challenge needs to be put down. Because if everyone that was upset with the U.S. government just picked up weapons and tried to take down the government, that would be very bad. We would be constantly living in a state of chaos. And so George Washington, now empowered as the commander-in-chief of the U.S. military, sends in a federal force to put down this so-called Whiskey Rebellion in Pennsylvania. And George Washington was criticized to a great extent for sending in such a big force to squash these poor Pennsylvania whiskey wheat farmers. But at the end of the day, it sends the message that if you're going to challenge laws and you're going to challenge the U.S. government, the government will defend itself and put you down. Now, I think that that's a pretty good wrap-up of Washington's two terms. On the domestic front, you could probably also throw in there that in 1791, the Bill of Rights was ratified, although if you know anything about the Constitution, the President doesn't actually play a direct role in passing of bills of rights or amendments. But that's a look at the domestic reforms or the domestic events of President Washington. I'll be back in 1 minute to go over the foreign affairs of the Washington presidency. Alright, Mr. Kenduck is back, and I'm ready to explain the foreign affairs that were part of the Washington presidency. So the first foreign affair that I want to discuss is the Native American Wars in the Old Northwest, otherwise known as the Northwest Indian Wars. And basically, these were a series of conflicts throughout the 1790s where the Native Americans who lived in what's today, Ohio, were fighting against the Americans. The Americans believed that they had won this property. The British had ceded it or given it to the Americans at the Treaty of Paris at the end of the Revolutionary War. But there was still quite a bit of Native American resistance to the Americans getting this land. And so there were a bunch of conflicts, and there was a battle called the Battle of Falling Timbers, and this was really the last battle in this series of conflicts, and the Americans won and the Indians lost. And there was this treaty called the Treaty of Greenville in 1795, and that's basically what established that that territory in the Ohio Valley region would be part of America, the way we know it. All right, and by the way, it is kind of important to know that in these Northwest Indian Wars, the British were arming the Native Americans, the British actually refused to leave the forts after the Treaty of Paris. There were a whole bunch of unresolved issues after the Revolutionary War, and that actually leads me to the next foreign affair in the Washington Presidency. It's known as Jay's Treaty, and it was negotiated by John Jay. And this was a treaty that the United States had with the British, and it was important because it first established that the British would, like I mentioned before, leave their old territories, their old forts in the northwest region and go back to Canada. So that's the first component of Jay's Treaty. Another component of Jay's Treaty is that the British wouldn't harass the Americans as much on the seas. So the first couple of decades of this nation's existence was characterized by ongoing warfare between England and France. They hated each other. They were main rivals and enemies, like Yankees Red Sox and Batman Joker. Well, that's the French and the British. Now, from the American perspective, this might actually seem like a golden opportunity, because if England and France are fighting each other, they're probably going to want to buy supplies from the United States. So it could be good for the U.S. economy, but it doesn't necessarily turn out that way, because every time that the British every time that the Americans try to trade with the British, the French Navy stops the American merchants and takes their stuff. And of course, likewise, whenever the United States tried to trade with France, the British Navy, the most powerful in the world, would stop and harass and take the goods of the American merchantmen. So the second part of the Jay's Treaty is that the British will, from here on in, compensate and at least pay the American merchantmen for their goods when they stop their ships out on the seas. Now, of course, there was one part of Jay's Treaty that was controversial, and that is the practice of impressment. And what that was when the British Navy would stop American merchant ships, take American men, and force them to serve in the British Navy. So that practice of impressment did not end with Jay's Treaty. So that was the people who were critical of Washington and John Jay for this treaty. They were upset at that. And then the third component of Jay's Treaty is kind of a byproduct, in that now the United States and Great Britain would be kind of like #1 trade partners, and that would be good for the economy. Of course, the most imports and exports that the United States had came from and went to the British. So that is Jay's Treaty, and that is really kind of the second biggest foreign affair in Washington's presidency. On a little side note, the French were really kind of ticked off at us for signing Jay's Treaty. They believed that the United States and France kind of still had this alliance left over from the Revolutionary War, but that was not the case, and the French were a little disappointed with us, and later on in history we would have a little scuffle, diplomatic and on the seas, with the French. All right, now the last kind of idea that I want to talk about is a speech that Washington wrote, known as Washington's Farewell Address. And there is one reference to foreign affairs that Washington makes in his farewell address, and that is Washington says that the United States should never make a permanent alliance with another country. So a temporary alliance like Jay's Treaty, well, that's okay, because, you know, we need friends in order to get places in life. And so that's one part of Washington's farewell address. And of course, another part of Washington's farewell address is actually more leaning towards the home front, and that is Washington warns that political parties are bad, and they will rip the country apart. With fighting and argument and infighting. So, of course, unfortunately for the country, the United States didn't really listen to Washington in the big picture, as we do have more permanent alliances. And of course, political parties do exist. In fact, they really started to exist even in the course of the Washington presidency, with this kind of debates that went on between Alexander Hamilton, the Federalist, and Thomas Jefferson, the Anti-Federalist. All right, so that wraps up my presentation tonight on Washington's presidency. If there's anything that you thought was historically inaccurate, please feel free to leave a comment. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you learned something. And don't forget to tune in to Kenduck's Classroom, where my motto is, don't get fooled again on your next history test. Thanks a lot, and have a nice evening.